Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we conclude our tranquil journey through the 100 Years' War in Part 2, beginning with the ambitious and decisive reign of Henry V, whose stunning victory at Agincourt seemed to secure English dominance over France, and gently arriving at the miraculous intervention of Joan of Arc, and the final French triumph that would end this century-spanning conflict forever. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which moment in this epic war touched you most deeply, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of medieval church bells and the whisper of autumn leaves to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. Henry V, later known as one of England's greatest warrior kings, ascended to the throne in 1413 with an unwavering determination to reclaim what he viewed as his rightful inheritance in France. Unlike his predecessors, who had been content with defensive strategies or limited campaigns, this young monarch would launch the most audacious phase of the entire 100 Years' War. The demands and preparations. Late 1414, a grand embassy was sent to Paris to discuss proposals for peace, but Henry's demands were extraordinarily ambitious. The 1360 Treaty of Bretigny was to be fully re-implemented, and England's lost territories in Aquitaine, Poitou, and Ponthieu were to be returned. More than that, any outstanding funds from Jean II's ransom agreement would be paid along with an additional £330,000, the annexation of Normandy, Maine, and Anjou, as well as overlordship of Brittany, Flanders, Beaufort, and Nogent. Perhaps Henry V was simply attempting to regain lost English lands in France, but such untenable terms might have been intended to be rejected. Whatever the case, the French did indeed reject them, and that made the resumption of war inevitable. With his rejection, the Dauphin of France, Louis of Guienne, sent the English king an insulting gift, arrogantly stating to the ambassadors that he would send to King Henry because he was young, little balls to play with and soft pillows to sleep on, to help him grow to manly strength. In response, Henry stated to his advisers that if perchance they thought to lie abed with soft pillows, then I, perchance before they wish, shall arouse them from their slumbers by hammering on their doors at dawn. With that, orders were sent out to raise the largest English army since Crecy. 320 captains were contracted to muster troops in various regions around the kingdom under an indenture, a legal contract between a soldier and the man he served under. It specified the conditions and length of service, disciplinary practices, pay grades, and other matters, and was a sign that mobilizing troops in England was becoming more professionalized. Other feudal lords raised retinues from their own fiefs, and Henry himself even drew warriors from his royal lands in Cheshire, Lancashire, and South Wales. Overall, the army which gathered in Southampton was around 12,000 strong with a large archer contingent. After dealing with a plot to depose him and executing its ringleaders, Henry V and his invasion force embarked from England on August 11, 1415, in around 700 ships. The king himself and his closest advisors sailed aboard a 500-ton flagship known as Les Trinite. The armada reached the Normandy coast 3 days later and disembarked near Chef-du-Caux at the mouth of the Seine River. Rather than launching a devastating chevauchée through the area, as his royal predecessors had, Henry marched to the strategic port of Harfleur and set up his base at the Priory of Gravel, from where he expected the small garrison to capitulate soon. The town had a ring of old walls, but its defenses had been reinforced in the expectation of an English arrival with ditches and wooden barbicans. And the local commander, the Lord of Estouteville, had further preparations made by closing off the harbor with chained ships. The river Lizarde had its sluices opened, flooding the plain north of the town and giving time to Raoul de Gaucourt, to reinforce the defenses with 300 men-at-arms, bolstering the defenders' numbers up to 400 men-at-arms, a number of crossbowmen, and the local townspeople who joined in the defense of their homes. Henry took up position to the west of the town on August 17th, while he sent his brother Duke of Clarence, Thomas, to the east. But the floodplains slowed him down, and he was in position only 2 days later, while the English navy prevented any supplies from entering the town by sea. Henry summoned Harfleur to surrender, but his demand was rejected, so the siege began. The English set up their batteries, which continuously pounded the defenses, protected by wooden shields and trenches. The defenders doggedly held on to their outer positions as long as they could and defended tenaciously the breaches created by the artillery, and during the night, the breaches were repaired as best as they could. They launched sorties to keep the enemy cannons as far away from the walls as possible. English mines' deep tunnels dug underneath the defenses meant to collapse the walls were stopped by French countermines. The defenders also managed to increase the water level of the Lézard, forcing some of the English to fall back. Still, slowly on the eastern side, the attackers managed to creep up on the outer trenches, where they placed their cannons at point-blank range. By the end of August, they managed to divert the river's flow, lowering the water level and depriving the defenders of fresh water. By the start of September, most of Harfleur's outer defenses were destroyed. Towers and walls were damaged, and their food supplies were running out. But still the French commanders decided to hold on and repelled English assaults on the breaches in the walls for 2 more weeks. Finally, by September 15th, the defenders asked for a truce and for the city to be surrendered if a French army would not arrive to relieve them before the 23rd. As the Dauphin was still assembling it, and it wasn't ready to march, Harfleur was surrendered to the English king on the agreed date. Its 260 surviving members of the garrison and the other combatants would be kept for ransom. Still, the unexpectedly dogged resistance of the small garrison had held off the English king for 6 weeks, during which the English army was ravaged by outbreaks of malaria and dysentery, which eventually killed or debilitated almost a third of its troops. At the time he was doing so, a large French army of about 20,000 men was slowly gathering in Rouen under the Dauphin, ready to intercept the English. Henry V wasn't the only thing Charles had to worry about. John the Fearless declared himself eager to join the fight against England, but his presence was judged to be detrimental, as it would only cause divisions in the army. So the Dauphin asked the Duke of Burgundy to send 800 troops instead of coming himself. But this insulted the Duke, and he instead refused to send any assistance. Throughout the entire campaign, the nominally Armagnac French leaders would have to keep one eye on Burgundy. It had long been rumored that he was collaborating with the English. Nevertheless, the delay at Harfleur put King Henry into a predicament. It was late in the campaigning season now, but he could not just sail back to England without achieving anything more. Nor could he risk marching toward Bordeaux as he had intended, or Paris itself. The army was too depleted, and an attack on the capital might forcibly reunite the French factions. Instead, it was decided that the army would head immediately for Calais, so that Henry might tread the same steps through his lands in Normandy and Ponthieu that his great-grandfather Edward III had. After garrisoning the newly captured Harfleur, the English army set out on its march, intending to remain on the coast all the way to Calais. The trek started well enough, and rivers near Dieppe and Eu were easily forded. But this all changed on the 13th, as Henry's army approached the old Roman ford over the Somme at Blanchetac, where the king planned to cross. A captured Gascon prisoner informed him that an advance guard of 6,000 French under Constable Charles d'Albret was waiting and ready to block any attempt to cross. Realizing that he would have to cross further inland, Henry pivoted right and marched upstream, shadowed all the way by d'Albret on the other side of the bank. After managing to shake his pursuers off, however, the English managed to cross at Nesle, but it was already too late. In the meantime, The main French army under Bourbon cut across the Somme at Amiens and proceeded to unite with d'Albret near Perrin. The tired English, racked by hunger, disease, and now almost completely depleted of supplies, continued marching north, and on October 23rd reached Blangy. It was there, as Henry's army crossed a tributary of the Great River, that it witnessed a terrifying sight. Drawn up on a slightly elevated ridge about a mile in front of them was the entire French army, rank after rank of magnificent mounted knights and men-at-arms. A sight which led the English king to draw up in battle formation as well. After a tense, hour-long standoff, the French pulled back even further and took up position for the night in a blocking position on the road to Calais, near a small hamlet known as Agincourt. On the night of October 24th, Henry ordered complete silence in the English camp, while the French could be heard rejoicing and celebrating across the rain-filled night air. The battlefield which both sides lined up on the following morning was an area of sodden, recently plowed field in an area between the village of Agincourt in the west, Tramecourt in the east, and Mason Cells in the south, bounded by forested terrain on the flanks of each army. Henry V's depleted army was now about 8,500 strong and severely lopsided in composition, with 7,000 archers and only 1,500 dismounted knights and men-at-arms. Due to its limited numbers, it was arrayed in a single line of battle. In the center were 3 small divisions of melee infantry, known as battles, with units of longbowmen between them. The left battle was under the command of the veteran Baron of Camoys. The right was led by Edward, Duke of York, while Henry V took control of the central division. Even more archers were equally placed on both the left and right flanks, with a significant portion in the woods on each side of the field. The archers were under the authority of Sir Thomas Erpingham. All of the army was protected by a defensive wall of stakes and caltrops, designed to blunt cavalry charges. On the other side of the field, a grand French royal army of around 20,000 was under the nominal but insecure dual command of Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, professional men whose relatively low birth meant that they were outranked by high nobles, such as the Dukes of Orléans, Alençon, and Bourbon. Their army was deployed in 3 lines of battle, the first and second, comprising most of France's proud dismounted knights and men-at-arms for use as a sledgehammer against the English, while a line of mainly archers and crossbowmen were kept in the rear. It was the duty of the nobility to win the battle, not mere bow-wielding peasants. On both flanks, a heavily armored cavalry force of around 750 knights each was in the process of forming up, while more units were slowly trickling into the French army as time went by. Having learned the harsh lesson from their defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, the French did not charge right away, and instead remained where they were. It was clear to d'Albret and Boucicaut that while their enemy's army would only wither away with time, their own would get even stronger, whatever its merits. The impetuous knights and nobles of France chafed at this cowardly strategy of delay. Seeing that the French weren't going to attack him, Henry V knew he had to make the first move before it was too late. So, after conferring with his captains, the king ordered his entire army to uproot its stakes and slowly shift forward in an orderly manner, supposedly shouting to his troops, "Fellows, let's go." After advancing into longbow range, the army once again hammered down its stakes, after which English archers immediately began loosing heavy volleys at the surprised knights out in front. This withering arrow fire panicked the hastily formed French cavalry units, and they now charged full tilt at Henry's line. Erpingham had the longbowmen knock an arrow and draw their bowstrings back, and then commanded them to wait. Then, as the French mounted knights, drawn from the very best horsemen in the army, came close to the line through the soaking mud of the field, Erpingham shouted, "Now strike!" and his archers loosed at point-blank range from the front and tree line. The sky darkened for a second before hundreds of knights and their horses were struck and slain by the dense volley of bodkin-tipped arrows. Those who did manage to get through were trapped on the sharp stakes or rooted back to their own lines. While the massacre of the mounted charge was going on, a group of peasants and cavalry, led by a few Burgundian nobles, looted Henry's baggage, train stealing the king's bedding, his crates of cash, and even one of his crowns. It didn't affect the course of the battle until later. D'Albret's first line of infantry was trudging with difficulty through often knee-deep mud at the same time, made worse by the preceding cavalry charge. A combination of the bad terrain, heavy armor, and having their cohesion disrupted by their own retreating cavalry left the French vanguard sitting ducks for lethally accurate English longbowmen, who loosed volley after volley into the almost immobile mass and inflicted horrific losses. Despite the setbacks, the flower of France's military might smashed into the thin English line like a tidal wave and immediately forced it back before the equally stubborn men-at-arms under Henry halted. The push. While a vicious melee began at the point of contact, the second line of infantry now pushed forward also, but they caused a crush upon nearing the vanguard, which prevented most of the army from engaging, and most frontline troops from retreating. Though the French were suffering, Henry's melee infantry was taking a mauling. In the right division, Edward, Duke of York, was cut down in some of the fiercest fighting, while Henry V himself was almost killed and a portion of his crown cut off. The archers on the flanks ran out of arrows. They charged in from the wings with whatever weapons they could find to assist their own warriors. Shortly after noon, the French attack collapsed, and the English took many prisoners of low and high rank, including the Dukes of Bourbon, Orléans, and Marshal Bouciut. At that moment, someone in the English formation shouted that enemy reinforcements were incoming, perhaps having seen the looters at the camp earlier in the battle. With the amount of captives they had taken, it was plausible their prisoner uprising rearmed with discarded equipment, along with fresh foes, might doom Henry's army. The English king therefore ordered 200 archers to go to the camp and kill almost every single soldier the army had taken captive. With thousands dead on the field of Agincourt and even more prisoners slaughtered in the din of battle, the terrified remainder of French forces retreated. That night, King Henry V of England made the captured Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon wait on his feasting table before reaching Calais and sailing home in mid-November. As Henry V sailed from Calais in late 1415, he left a deeply shocked France behind him. With the royal army destroyed and much of the Armagnac faction leadership with it, the Civil War appeared as though it was only going to get worse. Back in England, the jubilant king didn't bask in his success for long and immediately began raising funds, mustering troops, and assembling a great navy for a follow-up attack on France, while at the same time depriving the divided enemy kingdom of its allies. Aiming to heal the Western Schism, Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund arrived in England in early 1416, but ended up forming an alliance with Henry at Canterbury and denouncing France instead. At sea, the king's commanders crushed the Franco-Genoese fleet in 1416 and 1417, leaving the channel open for another crossing by the middle of that year. Henry had his army together and sailed to Normandy, this time going to conquer it entirely. On September 20th, the dominoes began to topple as Caen surrendered after a short siege. No relief was anywhere close, because any royal force which might have assisted was busy facing off against the Burgundians. Next to fall was the great Norman capital at Rouen. Henry put France's second city to siege at the end of July 1418, and after a brutal siege lasting over half a year, its garrison finally surrendered. With that, almost every other castle in the duchy surrendered, and by the turn of the decade, Normandy was under English control for the first time in 2 centuries. This frighteningly quick conquest horrified both the Armagnacs and Burgundians. Despite the latter's covert talks with Henry V, they realized such a full conquest wouldn't benefit them at all. Realizing something had to be done, both John the Fearless and France's new Dauphin, the future Charles VII, agreed to negotiate. However, when the Duke of Burgundy knelt before his Valois prince, Armagnac retainers accompanying Charles suddenly came forward and hacked John the Fearless to death revenge for Louis of Orleans' death over a decade before. Whatever the motive, it was a disaster for France. As Francis I stated a century later when shown the mutilated skull of the dead Duke, "This is the hole through which the English entered France." Wide swaths of the kingdom burst into uproar or panic at the Armagnac's brutal murder of John. But when the news reached his son and heir Philip in Flanders, he is said to have thrown himself on his bed, teeth grinding in grief and rage, seething, and eager for revenge. The new Duke of Burgundy formed an alliance with Henry V. The former would recognize the English king's claim to the throne of France, while the latter ensured Philip's territories were enlarged and secure. This was the last straw. Battered by the English invasion and tired of civil war, the barely lucid Charles VI signed the Treaty of Troyes on May 21, 1420. Henry V would be heir and regent of France. He would marry the Mad King's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and their child would be king as well. After capturing a few more towns loyal to the Dauphin, Henry spent Christmas in Paris before going back to England and crowning Catherine his queen. While this was happening, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, was defeated and killed at Baugé during March 1421, a defeat which convinced Brittany to defect to the Dauphin's reduced kingdom in October. However, Henry returned to France and took a few castles at Dreux, Vendôme, and Beaugency before putting Meaux to siege. It was there that King Henry fell ill with his army, but insisted on staying with the troops, which he did until the city fell in May 1422. Though he returned to Paris, the king fell deeper into sickness and began to take measures for the succession, naming Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, regent in England, while his brother, the Duke of Bedford, would lead in France in the name of the newborn Henry VI, England's great Lancastrian king, perhaps the greatest in the country's history. Died at Vincennes on August 31, 1422, at the age of just 35. The Mad King Charles VI finally died only 2 months later, and his son declared himself the king. Nevertheless, all of France north of the Loire came under Anglo-Burgundian rule, while his son only retained the loyalty of the south with a moving court. In 1423, the Treaty of Amiens was signed, binding together the Duchy of Burgundy, the Duchy of Brittany, and the Kingdom of England, and recognizing Henry VI as the King of France. It was sealed with Bedford marrying Anne, the Duke of Burgundy's sister, but the actual allegiance of Brittany would sway with the strongest party in the following years. In July 1423, as the English were fortifying their positions north of the Loire River and besieging strongholds loyal to Charles, an army loyal to the Dauphin, accompanied by a large contingent of Scots and smaller Italian and Spanish units under Sir John Stuart and Louis of Vendôme, marched through the territories of the Duke of Burgundy to relieve their allies and to threaten Paris. They were defeated at Crevant, near Auxerre, by an English army under Salisbury with the help of Burgundian units. However, the French found fortune in the west, where an English raiding army was caught and destroyed at La Buissonnière by local Norman garrisons loyal to Charles. In the spring of 1424, a contingent of 6,500 Scottish soldiers under the Earl of Douglas landed in France, joining the army of the Dauphin. As the campaigning season began with the usual change of control of border forts, in August, the Dauphin's army under the Count of Anjou moved toward the castle of Ivry to relieve it from a siege. As it became clear that they were too late and that the English position was too strong for a direct attack, the Armagnacs deviated west and took over Vaunoy, where reinforcements from Italy came. Here, the English army under Bedford joined them on August 17th, furious that the French had not joined in battle at Ivry, as previously agreed upon. The English army numbered around 8,000 men, with a significant number of them being Norman noblemen, while the French numbers were between 14,000 to 16,000, of which 6,500 were Scottish archers and axe-wielders. 2,000 were heavily armored Lombard knights, and some other soldiers came from Spain. On a plain a mile north of Verneuil, the English positioned themselves with a compact contingent of men-at-arms on foot, flanked by longbowmen with their sharp stakes, while around 1,000 lightly armored men were placed in the back with the task of guarding the baggage train and the horses and stopping any attack from the back. The French also dismounted many of their men-at-arms, but the Lombard knights and some of the French remained saddled. To the surprise of the English, they did not position themselves on the wings as customary, but instead formed up in front of the contingent on foot. After a short exchange of arrow fire, the Lombard mercenaries charged against the enemy. Bedford had some of his archers moved in front of his lines to counter it, but the missiles could do little against the superior Italian armor, which also covered their steeds. The knights plowed straight through the English lines, splitting the division in two, as men were either cut down or moved away to make place for the unstoppable force. Emerging from the other side, the Milanese continued their charge against the baggage guard and chased them off the battlefield. Understanding that he had to achieve victory before the Italians returned, Bedford regrouped his foot soldiers and ordered them to advance. So did the French and Scottish contingent, but the latter proved less disciplined in their advance. And as a fierce and confusing melee began, the English and Norman men-at-arms slowly proved superior. When the lightly armored longbowmen finally joined the fray, the French line broke, and a brutal killing field began where many French nobles and all their commanders perished around the ditch defending the town, as did most of the Scots. For over 7,000 dead. As the Lombards returned, expecting the French to win, they were driven away, while a few important nobles, such as the Duke of Alencon, were taken captive. The defeat at Verneuil was disastrous for the future Charles VII, as it has been remembered as a second Agincourt, and it forced him to rethink his plans to be crowned at Reims, while Bedford's prestige was increased, and he had the momentum for the rest of the year. Unfortunately for the English, Gloucester's blundering meant that Bedford was forced to return to England for 2 years to put things straight, and only sailed back to France in March 1427. He and Salisbury now started planning a campaign to capture Orléans, the key to the Loire. If this great riverine linchpin was conquered, the English could easily launch further attacks to knock the Dauphin out for good. After capturing more than 40 towns and fortresses along the way, Salisbury approached Orléans in early October 1428, at the time garrisoned by 2,400 regular soldiers and a further 3,000 militia. Contingent of the English army under Suffolk captured both Jargeau and Châteauneuf to isolate the city, while Salisbury encamped opposite French defenses on the southern end of Orléans' 350-meter-long bridge. He began an initial artillery bombardment on the 17th, and 4 days later ordered his men to storm the fortified gatehouse, known as Les Tourelles. This attack was driven away by the defenders after each side took around 200 losses, with the Dauphinist French being constantly resupplied with food, drink, and arms by the city's women. When the direct attack failed, Salisbury abandoned this approach and instead sent sappers to undermine the foundations. Realizing this was happening, the Guardians of Les Tourelles retreated deeper into the city on the night of October 23rd, destroying a small part of the bridge behind them. The fall of this fortification seemed like Orléans' doom, but as the aggressive Salisbury climbed atop Les Tourelles to decide where to attack next, a stray cannonball clattered through the window, killed one of his companions, and flung an iron bar at the Earl, slicing half his face off. Incapacitated and in agony, he was replaced by William, Earl of Suffolk, before dying a week later. The more cautious Suffolk decided on a prolonged siege, and in the next week, the English began constructing siege works at about the same time. Orléans received some additional reinforcements from the southeast. The city was too large to be entirely cut off by such a small force. The city's defenders started bracing for an extended engagement as well by burning and tearing down the suburbs outside the walls, depriving the English of cover and winter quarters by doing so. Starting on November 8th, English boats began ferrying men across the Loire and constructing siege positions to the north and west of the city. The French responded with a few unsuccessful sorties, and to compound these failures, by the turn of December, the besiegers had been reinforced. While the northern bank siege works were being constructed, the English launched a failed probing assault across the broken Loire Bridge. The defenders responded with massive 26-pound shots from a new bombard, and by completing the leveling of their suburbs. As 1429 began, Orléans' would-be captors shifted focus to the now fortified north bank with a number of easily repelled assaults on the Port Renard in January. The loose nature of the encirclement also allowed a supply convoy, including hundreds of sheep and pigs, to reach the city. As gallant resistance continued, 200 men of the garrison slipped out of Orléans and joined a 3,000-strong French force at Blois. Having received reports of an enemy supply caravan approaching from Paris to resupply the besiegers, they marched to intercept near Rouvray. However, when the French and Scots under Clermont found the 1,500-strong caravan on February 12th, their assault over the open country was repulsed and counterattacked from behind a ring of supply wagons. 400 of the Dauphin's troops, mainly Scots, were killed, and Clermont subsequently withdrew to Tours, along with a number of other commanders. Certain of defeat. At Chinon, Charles was so demoralized by the grand city's seemingly inevitable fall that he considered abandoning his kingdom completely. However, events many hundreds of miles to the east were about to thoroughly rejuvenate the French cause. 3 years before, a 15-year-old girl named Joan began hearing voices, and by 1428 became convinced she was being granted a task from God, delivered by the Archangel Michael, in addition to Saints Margaret and Catherine. Her task? To lead an army against the English so that Orléans might be relieved, and to have the Dauphin traditionally crowned as Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, where Louis the Pious had succeeded to the Frankish throne 6 centuries earlier. Through aid from Robert de Baudricourt, a Pro-Valois commander in Vaucouleurs, Joan undertook a dangerous journey to Chinon and then to Poitiers, where her faith was declared true and her virginity assured. To test whether this woman's extraordinary claims were true, she would be sent to Orléans in an attempt to break the siege. After being granted armor, horses, a special banner, and supposedly finding a legendary sword, she went to Blois and joined a gathering relief force. Upon her arrival, the deflated mood among French soldiers and officers immediately began changing at her holy presence. Leaders who had withdrawn from the siege previously, such as Clermont, or who had avoided getting involved at all, now rallied to the cause, inspired by Joan's patriotic mission, while the Dauphin's army mustered, the lull at Orléans following. Rouvray allowed English forces, who were aware that a relief attempt was incoming, to construct a number of formidable fortifications: the Bastille de Saint-Loup to the east, the Boulevard de la Pressoirs on April 9th, the Bastille Saint-Pouard on the 15th, and Bastille de Saint-Jean-le-Blanc 5 days later. Notably, new English commander Glasdale created an external earthen rampart outside Les Tourelles, making it into a citadel. Joan and her relief force set out for Orléans on the 26th. After a miraculous crossing of the Loire at Chisy and bypassing Saint-Loup without opposition, entered the city through its Burgundian gate 3 days after. Leaving Blois after resting for the night, Joan was eager to go on the attack. Because one wasn't planned for that day, she walked across the Lough Bridge to the Belcroix stronghold and asked the English to lift the siege. Glassdale shouted back that she was a mere coward and they would burn her if she was captured. Nevertheless, Joan's threat to kill all prisoners their forces had taken if her heralds were not released worked, and they were indeed set free. Also, on that day, a lengthy skirmish was fought when French commander La Hire sorted out against the northern English fortification at Saint-Pour, but was eventually forced back inside. This inability led the overall defending leader, Jean d'Étais, Dunois the bastard of Orléans, to slip out of the city on May 1st and return to Blois, where he sought reinforcements. While he was gone, Joan didn't remain inactive. She rejuvenated the morale of Orléans' long-besieged citizens, who crowded to meet her and give their maid gifts, while also performing military reconnaissance against Glassdale's positions to see which were weak and which were strong. Dunois returned on May 4th with much-needed reinforcements, and shortly after, an attack began spontaneously on England's eastern fort at Saint-Lô by 1,500 troops. Joan was resting at the time, but when informed either by an angel's voice or any of the other mortal voices in the city, rode out as swiftly and eagerly as possible to join the attack. For 3 grueling hours, Joan inspired her warriors to fight. Despite fierce resistance by the English garrison, the French soldiers managed to finally capture and raise Saint-Lô to the joy of Orléans' people. Despite her jubilation at the victory, Joan of Arc wept for the 140 slain English soldiers who had died without confession. Still, the officers remained cautious, but this was shattered when news came from Paris of a large incoming Anglo-Burgundian relief army led by John Fastolf. It was now clear that the siege had to be broken before it got to Orléans, or all their bravery would be for nothing. On the 5th, French forces crossed the Loire in order to attack Saint-Jean-le-Blanc-en-Earthen, fortification protecting Les Tourelles. But when the English withdrew to the gatehouse itself, the defenders managed to occupy the outlying position. The next day, Joan crossed the Loire again, pushing the troops forward against the Bastille des Augustins. After a ferocious clash in which the French had to use a cannon to take down a particularly big Englishman, they overran the fortress. Glassdale's remaining fortresses retreated behind the boulevard, protecting Les Tourelles. With divine favor seemingly on their side and momentum at their back, the French attacked Les Tourelles' outer defenses on the 7th by escalade, but were repelled at first with heavy losses. During the fighting, Joan herself was even struck between the shoulder and neck by an English arrow, but fought on nonetheless. After going off to pray in a nearby vineyard for guidance, Joan of Arc returned with her banner in hand, motivating the French to a final attack in which they managed to drive the besiegers from the fortification in front of the Les Tourelles gate. The Maid of Orléans called on Glassdale to surrender, but he refused. When he subsequently attempted to lead his remaining troops across the drawbridge and to the inner gatehouse, the timber cracked under the weight of so many soldiers and dropped many into the Loire. Glassdale himself, clad in heavy armor alone, with many of his men, drowned. Morale inside the inner fortress crumbled after this loss, and the surviving English inside quickly surrendered. On the northern Loire bank, the remaining English troops abandoned their siege lines and formed up in 2 large battle formations, challenging the French to open battle when Joan and the other commanders lined up in front of them and prepared. For battle, however, the besiegers lost their nerve and turned to march away. Their army split, one group moving to garrison Jargeau, while another went to man Meung, all the way being harried by French troops who disobeyed orders to ride them. After 210 days, the siege of Orléans was over. The Dauphin's loyal, capable army had held firm, and Joan of Arc was enshrined forever in history as the Maid of Orléans. Joan pushed for an immediate advance to crown Charles, but the French commanders said that with the English still holding, castles on the Loire. They weren't yet in a position to do that. So in mid-June, the army, with an enthusiastic Joan of Arc in tow, began retaking them one by one. Jargeau fell on the 12th, Beaugency on the eve of the 17th, and then finally Meung at dawn on the 18th. The remaining English forces under Talbot retreated north and united with Sir Fastolf's southward marching relief army, bringing their strength up to around 5,000. While Fastolf, commander of the united forces, preached caution, he was overpowered by his subordinates headed by Talbot, who wanted to help the strongholds on the Loire as they were about to relieve. Meung, news of the fall of Beaugency had reached them. Worried they would be trapped between the two French forces, they began to march north. The French, discovering the English army's movement, prepared a vanguard of around 1,500 men-at-arms under La Hire and Jean des Entrailles, and sent them north. Fastolf learned that he was hotly pursued when he was near the village of Pétion, an old Roman road. He had to set his army up to confront them, most of them being longbowmen. The English positioned themselves in a defensive position on a ridge, with the baggage and artillery positioned on the flank near a forest, while 500 of their best archers were sent in an advanced position to ambush the French vanguard. Once the English ambush force was in place, a stag ran into them, which raised an alarm among the archers, giving away their positions to the nearby French scouts. Because of this, Talbot ordered them to move to another place, but before the longbows could take up position with their sharpened stakes near the hedges where the baggage train was, the French vanguard crashed upon them. The knights cut through their lightly armored enemies before they could fire their deadly volleys. Remnants of the English vanguard fled back to the main contingent of Englishmen. Still, the French men-at-arms took advantage of their confused and unprepared enemies and hit the main contingent on the undefended flank, destroying and slaughtering anything that was unfortunate enough to be on their path. Many of the English captains were captured, except for Sir Fastolf, who was mounted and managed to escape with around half of his force. The English suffered around 2,500 killed or captured. While the French losses were negligible, the French heavy cavalry had finally defeated the English longbowmen, which had caused so many defeats, such as Crecy and Agincourt, dispelling the myth of the invincibility of England's armies in the field for good. Such a great victory in the open field finally encouraged the Dauphin to accompany Joan of Arc and his newly enlarged 12,000-strong army in a march toward Reims. There, on July 17, 1429, the long-beleaguered son of Charles the Mad was crowned as Charles VII in the city's grand cathedral, as the Maid of Orléans stood at his side, holy banner in hand. This was militarily insignificant, but a propaganda triumph. The momentous coronation of Charles VII at Reims in the summer of 1429 gave England's regent in France the popular and capable John of Bedford time to brace Paris itself for an assault by the new king's inspired forces. When it came in late August, once again with Joan of Arc leading the charge, Bedford was prepared, and after a few skirmishes and a brief siege, the French were repelled. The momentum of Orléans had run its course, and Charles ordered his army away for winter. By this point in the war, Joan was becoming politically troublesome for the restored Valois monarchy, despite her role in boosting French morale in the dark decade of the 1420s. After continuing campaigns on her own for a few months, she was captured at Compiègne by the Burgundians and then sold to the English in November. After one of the most notorious religious trials in world history, the Maid of Orleans was burned at the stake by English soldiers in Rome, convicted as a heretic. At the time of her death in May 1431, Joan of Arc was only 19 years old. Charles VII made no attempt to save her. On the military front, Bedford managed to stabilize the situation by re-establishing control around Paris by taking some towns and castles, including Chateau Galliard and Lauviers. This gave Bedford an opportunity to emulate Charles's propaganda coup 2 years prior. On December 16, 1431, Henry VI of England was also crowned Henry II of France. However, his Burgundian allies did not manage to make any advances, as Philip of Burgundy had to establish control over his newly inherited Duchy of Brabant. As small attempts at peace talks were made, which led to nothing, the Duke of Burgundy used his ambiguous position to play the two sides against each other and try to obtain the most out of the situation, signing intermittent truces with the Armagnacs. In the following years. Much of the military operations were concentrated around Paris, where sieges and raids were launched against different forts. The French attempted to cut the communication lines between Paris and Normandy and along the Normandy Maine border. However, all things taken into account, the war was not going well for the English, who no longer had adequate finances or manpower to defend their 350-mile-long line of contact in France, fund the modern war with gunpowder siege weapons, or maintain their many garrisons. It was only through Bedford's capability and love of him among the Anglo-French that the lands were maintained, despite minor English success in retaking some rebellious Norman castles in 1434. The revolt continued to bleed the occupiers of much-needed resources, and their situation continued to deteriorate. Even more unfortunately for the English, their most important ally could see the way the winds were blowing. The dual monarchy suffered two body blows in quick succession during 1435. On September 14th, the ailing Duke of Bedford finally passed away at Rouen and was replaced by Richard of York. Worse still was the Treaty of Arras, signed on September 20th between King Charles VII and Philip of Burgundy. This finally reconciled the feuding French factions in a settlement which granted the Duchy of Burgundy even more territory in return for Philip's formal recognition of Charles VII as the French king. This political sea change had an immediate effect, as unrest began to occur all over the English lands in France. Moreover, the armies of Charles VII defeated an English army at Gerberoi, which allowed them to strengthen their control over Picardy and managed to capture Saint Denis in the summer of 1435 and Milan in September, although the burial site of the French king was briefly lost between September and February. These two conquests encircled Paris, blocking the most critical supply routes to the capital, which saw its food prices soar. This caused discontent among the citizens, which ultimately led to the start of a siege on Paris, where Armagnac and Burgundian men joined forces. The Burgundian-filed Paris returned to Charles's hands on April 13th, with the remnant English garrisons leaving the city a few days later. At the same time, the Armagnacs made headway northern Normandy, with the two important coastal towns of Dieppe and Harfleur were captured. They were crucial for ferrying reinforcements and supplies across the Channel, and without them, the English had a hard time launching campaigns on the continent. The Duke of Burgundy attempted to take advantage of the situation and invested the town of Calais in 1436. But the arrival of an English relief army under Beaufort lifted the siege, allowing the town to stay in English hands for another century. In 1437, Talbot attempted one of the last advances along the Seine. After having secured some parts of Upper Normandy, he recaptured the important town of Pontoise, but by this point, English military policy was to hold on to their lands in Normandy, while the French slowly took castle by castle on their border, or that had remained under England in their backs. As Henry VI came out of the minority and began to govern in his own name in 1437. Peace negotiations in 1439 failed, and over the next few years, England's position on the continent only got worse, and their operations in Picardy and Normandy ended in failure, save for the reconquest of Harfleur, first Meaux in 1439, and then Creil and Pontoise, the last English foothold in the French Crown lands, with a powerful artillery train of Jean Bureau. was put into good use fell in 1441, as did Evero. The year after, Gascony was attacked for the first time in decades, while English, where Charles VII relieved the besieged Tartas and captured some towns. The English responses, an attempt to besiege Dieppe and a campaign into Anjou, did not yield results, because a group favoring peace with France at any cost, led by the Duke of Suffolk, had great influence with the king in England. The latter led an embassy to Tours in early 1444 for a conference. France's delegates were unwilling to make any kind of compromise. The deal was in reality a desperate one for Suffolk. In return for an extendable 2-year truce, Henry VI would be betrothed to the niece of Charles VII, Margaret of Anjou, and England would cede Maine to France. Though the peace came as a great relief to English civilian settlers in northern France, who were on the receiving end of increasing French attacks, it was generally received with fury in England, and served as one of the factors which made the Wars of the Roses inevitable a decade or so later. As Henry's realm started falling apart, Charles made good use of the truce to embark on a series of military and monetary reforms which would forever change the feudal France which he had fought so hard to inherit. The taille direct land tax, which had only been occasional until this point, became permanent and funded the king's changes. Feudal French armies had been hired by contract for centuries, and usually went home at the end of the year. Starting in 1444, however, only the poorer quality units were discharged, while the better contingents were retained as the core of a new standing army. January 5, 1445, the French royal government officially announced the formation of compagnies, d'ordonnance regular units of troops, supplemented by bringing the highest quality bands of routiers and accoucheurs, many of whom were dismissed mercenaries, to the king's service. To ensure their continued loyalty, discipline, and relatively high moral standards. These new professional soldiers were paid monthly with the new revenues. Recruitment of former freelance soldiers cut down the amount of banditry in the kingdom, while also making use of an untapped reserve of experienced manpower. Other, less reputable accoucheurs were viewed as an impediment to peace, little better than the outlaws which had tormented France for decades. Another vital part of Charles's modernization of the French army was his integration of modern gunpowder, artillery, which emerged in European armies during the early 15th century. Particularly revolutionary was the development of so-called crumbled gunpowder, which didn't disintegrate into its separate components when moved, and was therefore far more reliable and far more effective. Technological advances, including multiple powder chambers on breech-loading cannons, meant that newer cannons could have a surprisingly high rate of fire. Enter the brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau, sons of a merchant in the service of Charles VII. After being appointed to the task, the duo regularized the haphazard and sporadic variety of cannons currently used by inexperienced French forces. Proper usage for each type of gun was specified, and a greater level of training and professionalism was instilled into a previously relatively neglected arm of the military. In addition, the brothers used France's new fiscal strength to purchase standardized, higher quality bronze gun barrels. Larger bombards were retained for heavier siege duties, such as battering down castle walls, while smaller caliber guns, such as the culverin, would be used against infantry targets. In Normandy and the formerly relinquished county of Maine, it was becoming clear that the Duke of York and his military forces in France weren't going to dance to the conciliatory tune of Henry VI's advisors. To them, it was inevitable that more territory would fall if the French weren't resisted now, and so the garrisons of Maine refused to leave their fortresses, such as the capital at Les Mans. This provoked threats of renewed warfare with France in late 1447, but the garrisons did hesitantly withdraw from Maine in March 1448, further diminishing the English position in now exposed Normandy. Soon after, York was sent to govern Ireland as a means of getting him out of the way, and was replaced in France by his great rival Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. The tension in Normandy finally came to a climax when the captain of Verneuil, Francois de Surien, attacked a Breton fortress at Fougeres with Suffolk's backing in March 1449. The town was badly sacked, and its fall prompted the then neutral Duke of Brittany-Francois, the first to ask Charles VII for help. Somerset refused to apologize for his subordinate's act, and the French retaliated by quickly seizing castles at Pont de l'Arc, Gerberoy, and Conques. By late May, France offered to exchange Fougeres for these towns, but was refused. This made the resumption of war inevitable, and it was finally declared at the end of July. Charles VII crossed the Loire in August and took personal command of the southernmost of 4 armies, which now simultaneously invaded the weakened English lands in Normandy. It was a total walkover. On the 8th, French forces took Pont-d'Artimer, and Somerset's other castles began to fall with alarming frequency, their garrisons having been consistently reduced over the decades. A few weeks later, on the 26th, the inhabitants of Mantes rose against the English, seized control of a gate, and forced the garrison to surrender to Charles's troops. In September, Breton forces completed their conquest of the Cotentin Peninsula south of the Grand Bay and handed it over to French royal officials, while at the same time the Duke of Alençon took back the city which bore his name, which had been beyond the man's control for decades. On October 16th, the king's personal force led by Dunois besieged the glorious Anglo-Norman capital at Rouen. Knowing no relief was coming, Somerset surrendered the city in less than a week and was allowed to march with his garrison to English-held Candac. So driven were the French to complete the Reconquest that their operations continued into winter, and they eventually managed to recapture the crucial channel ports at Harfleur and Honfleur. By the time Charles's offensive halted, England only retained a small area of central western Normandy around Caen and Bayeux, in addition to the Cotentin Peninsula's northern segment, with Cherbourg as its most important city. In England, 2 of the most powerful figures in the kingdom, Queen Margaret and Suffolk, raised a formidable army of 4,500 men and the ships with which to transport them to Normandy. Sir Thomas Curiel was put in command of the force. He was a veteran of the war in France and a Knight of the Garter who came from a family of middle-ranking knights which, for centuries, had served the kings of England as sheriffs and in other similar roles. However, the expedition was delayed because of a lack of ships and the onset of winter. Worse still, when the army learned that their second installment of pay was to be postponed, they mutinied and killed one of the king's officials. Suffolk was widely regarded as the cause of the unrest through maladministration, and when he attempted to flee across the Channel to escape his enemies, he was assassinated in May 1450. Despite a false start to the campaign, Curiel and his soldiers sailed from Portsmouth as soon as the weather in 1450 permitted. Landing at Cherbourg on March 15th, these reinforcements instantly boosted the faltering morale of the English in Normandy and led to Curiel's army receiving a further 1,800 reinforcements from the large nearby garrisons. France's garrison at Valognes realized that it was in danger and requested support from the south. But Curiel pounced too quickly, besieging the castle for 3 weeks before it finally surrendered on April 10th. The squire in charge of the fortification, Abel Rouault, was permitted to depart with his garrison, supplies, horses, and possessions. In return for the capitulation, after learning of the new English invasion, Charles VII sent some of his best units and most capable lieutenants to inform and reinforce his commander in the area, Jean de Clermont. Having missed the opportunity to save Valognes, he established himself at Carentan, on the main road that Curiel would most likely use to move south. There, Clermont sent word to the Breton Constable of France, Arthur de Richemont, asking him to move his forces to Saint-Lay in case Curiel marched that way. Meanwhile, the English moved slowly south, absorbing manpower, artillery, and other siege weapons along the way. French scouts informed their commander that rather than passing by his location, Kirill and the English army were instead executing a potentially dangerous, but incredibly well executed, march through the low-lying tidal marshlands near the Granvée, which they accomplished on April 14th with only minor resistance. Local farmers and other peasants were supplemented by a company of men-at-arms, but were easily brushed aside. Matthew Goff, one of the English captains, supposedly shouted at them, "Mad dogs, we crossed despite you." After successfully getting past the harsh terrain, Kirill's army set up camp for the night at a village known as Formigny, while Goff was sent ahead to Bayard in order to get reinforcements. Clermont moved to close the distance with the English at dawn on the 15th and sent another message to de Richemont asking to be reinforced. After receiving the call for aid, he too set out for Formigny early on the 15th, but wouldn't reach the field before the fighting began. At the English position, Kirill's 6,000 troops spent the morning hours constructing a line of field entrenchments made up of ditches, potholes, earthen palisades, and sharpened stakes to block the main eastward road. Accompanying this was a smaller series of fortifications to the east of Formigny. They had made the village a makeshift fortress. As midday approached, English outriders returned from the west and informed Sir Kirill that a French army was approaching. In a hurry, the English knight had Goff recalled from Bayeux. Realizing he was about to be engaged, Kirill drew up his archer-heavy forces in a battle array. His own 4,500 were placed on the right side of the line, anchored on the village of Formigny, while Goff led about 1,500 troops on the left near the Val stream. Clermont's 3,000-strong army of men-at-arms, mounted crossbowmen, and some artillerists began to enter the area shortly after noon, led by an elite Scottish vanguard company. When his forces approached the Val, they wisely halted about 600 meters away from their enemy, well out of longbow range. At a safe distance, the French forces formed up west of a bridge between them and the English, and for 3 hours Clermont's men remained where they were, while the general conferred with his advisors. The older captains cautioned restraint, while their younger counterparts urged an immediate attack before the English defenses grew any stronger. Clermont, who would later be known as the Scourge of the English, opened the battle by sending forward 2 light culverins protected by a few hundred crossbowmen and men-at-arms. When the cannons opened fire, stationary English troops suffered heavy casualties from the unexpected artillery fire. Matthew Goff reacted first, sending 500 archers across the bridge to attack the small artillery position. They drove away the French gunners, captured the culverins, and killed those protecting them. Panicked by the setback, Clermont ordered a group of local peasants to scour the countryside south of the battlefield in order to find the Richemont. He needed reinforcements as soon as possible. At the same time, the French commander sent a larger unit of men-at-arms under Pierre de Breze to reinforce their beleaguered comrades and engage the enemy troops. Though this fierce melee started well for the French under Clermont, Kirill sent more reinforcements to bolster Goff's soldiers, and it began to tilt in favor of the numerically superior English. Official reports to the French king, written only days after the battle, later state that if Kirill's army had launched a full-scale attack at this point, Clermont would have been defeated. That attack never came. As the clash went on in the center, a small army of around 1,000 men emerged onto the plateau south of the battlefield. The English were jubilant, celebrating that reinforcements had arrived to finish the French off from the flank. However, as the third force got closer, the sight of French and Breton banners made both sides realize what was happening. Arthur de Richemont's army had arrived, and Kirill was now the one in danger of being hit from the rear. De Richemont rode quickly with his advance guard to confer with Clermont, while the main Breton force remained on the English side of the Val. This was tactically problematic for Kirill's army, but it is likely that his numbers still considerably outstripped those of either French commander in response. Sir Kirill had Gough's smaller contingent on the left start to redeploy, pivoting to face de Richemont's main army to the south. However, the elite Breton advance guard used the opportunity to fight their way across the bridge, slaying 6 scores of their English enemy, whilst doing so and disrupting Gough's redeployment effort, with disarray now the order of the day among his enemy's troops. The Breton constable returned to his main army and advanced northeast toward the English rear, while at the same time Clermont assaulted their front. Also, at the same time, Pierre de Breze had mounted a few hundred men and rode around the field, seizing control of the eastern fortifications and preventing any substantial retreat. Kirill did his best to rally the now disorganized and demoralized English in the village, but Breze charged them from behind, while both main armies attacked from different angles. To make this worse, the town peasants rose up and joined in, a developing slaughter. The main English army was totally destroyed. Only Gough and Robert Vere survived to lead their surviving soldiers back to Bayeux and Caen, respectively. One group of 500 longbowmen withdrew to a garden next to the Val and were on their knees begging for mercy. Nevertheless, Clermont's troops slew them anyway. The English commander Sir Thomas Kirill was taken prisoner, along with about 1,200 others, while around 3,800 of the knight's men perished at Formigny. This defeat finally broke the back of England's military hopes in Normandy. Most garrisons had contributed forces to Kirill's army, and his defeat now denuded them of defenders. Just over 2 months after the triumph of France's armies at Formigny, it had also seized Vire, Avranches, and Bayeux on May 16th. In June, Caen was besieged and taken a few weeks later. Charles VII rode north and ceremonially entered the city. On June 6th, with only little resistance, the Cotentin Peninsula city of Cherbourg finally went down on August 22, 1450. All of Normandy was now under French control for the first time in almost 3 decades. The Duke of Somerset's complete loss of northern France in such a blitzkrieg-like manner sent yet another political shockwave throughout England and pushed the kingdom closer to civil war. The Duke was briefly imprisoned in the Tower, and this internal strife only distracted the government from dealing with new problems on the continent. France was able to turn its efforts fully south toward Gascony with the victory. Back in 1449, local forces subordinate to Charles had already captured Cognac, Saint-Megrin, and Mullion. Meanwhile, the Count of Foix, a powerful magnate in the south of France, allied with the ascendant king in the same year and put his considerable military force to good use, capturing Diche and 15 other castles. Despite this preliminary success, Gascony in its entirety would probably be far more difficult to capture and hold than Normandy. It had been a fief of the kings of England for over 3 centuries compared to Normandy's 30 years, and most of the area's nobility and population still remained loyal to their longtime rulers. There were many reasons for this, but trade was a primary factor. Between 1445 and 1449, for example, wine exports to England reached never-before-seen heights. Gascon merchants and lords were making vast profits from their overlords and weren't keen to see the status quo change. Only 2 months after the fall of Cherbourg, in October 1450, French forces opened the attack on Gascony by putting Jonzac under siege. The castle fell in short order, and the army marched south, clashing with a small Anglo-Gascon force outside Bordeaux and crushing it before withdrawing to Angoulême for the winter. Campaigning began again in spring 1451, and the French army quickly captured Nantes after a short siege. From that point, just like in the fall of Normandy, Gascon castles fell very quickly. Blaye was captured on May 24th, followed by Bourg, Saint-Emilion, and Castillon. In the 5 days after that, the speed of the conquest was made possible by strong French artillery, in addition to well-executed diplomacy and bribery. which undermined baronial resistance. A decisive instance of the latter occurred on June 23rd, when the central city of Bordeaux surrendered without a fight, as its mayor received a generous pension from the French king as a reward. Just over a month later, Bayonne too was captured, and the feuding English could do nothing but watch in horror as their last continental possession, save for Calais, slipped away. Unfortunately for the French, they hadn't learned from the Black Prince's mistake after the Treaty of Bretigny and started levying heavy taxation on the newly acquired Gascon territory in order to pay for its defense. Not surprisingly, this, along with the rapaciousness of French soldiers, meant that resentment immediately began to build. At the same time, the Kingdom of England was not prepared to let Gascony go without a fight, but military preparations were slow, impeded by a deteriorating political situation that seemed to reach its climax in early 1452. Richard of York owned vast estates on the Welsh borders, and it was there, while he was in Ireland, that the tenants rose up in revolt against Henry VI in February. The rebels persuaded their lord to return from his quasi-exile and put an end to the Queen's regime. An army quickly gathered around York when he crossed back into England, and he began moving toward London. The Lancastrians mustered a force of their own and faced off against York at Dartford. Rather than attacking, the Duke of York presented Henry with a list of grievances and demands, which included the arrest of Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset and York's bitter rival, who was accused of badly mismanaging the defense of France in previous years. The weak monarch initially agreed to the demand, but the power behind his throne, Margaret of Anjou, intervened and eventually forced York to back down and reaffirm his loyalty to the crown. Somerset was left in charge of the government. While this was going on, indentures had managed to raise an army of some 3,000 troops under the command of a 65-year-old John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. Setting the stage for his attack was the situation in Gascony. Unrest had turned to subterfuge, and envoys reached London in 1452, inviting the English back and offering to provide assistance if they returned. After English ships swept their French counterparts off the seas, Talbot audaciously sailed the long distance to Gascony and disembarked on the Medoc Peninsula on October 17th. Less than a week later, the pre-planned anti-French uprising in Bordeaux led to the city's capitulation. Most other castles in western Gascony fell by the end of the year, save a few holdouts. It was obvious that Talbot's bold attack had taken Charles VII totally by surprise, as his forces had been shifted to Normandy in order to counter a possible invasion there. The English received 4,000 additional troops and supplies from home during the winter, while Charles, enraged at the Gascon treachery, hurried to send advanced forces south to reinforce those castles still under French control, while he prepared to lead an invasion of the recalcitrant province in person. In early June 1453, 4 separate, smaller armies began to muster at different points along the frontier with Gascony, preparing to invade on multiple fronts. 2 southern armies assembled in Languedoc under the Count de Clermont and Gaston IV, Count of Foix, who prepared his forces nearby at Bas-Arnaud in the north. A 3rd army commanded by Marshals de Chalons and Lohic readied to march from around Angoulême. Charles VII headed a strategic reserve army stationed in the Lusignan region. The king made sure that all of the contingents were well supplied with siege engines and gunpowder artillery, particularly the northern one at Angoulême, which was accompanied by Charles's artillery master, Jean Bureau. The combined French advance began almost simultaneously in early June. In the south, Foix and Clermont marched in close cooperation from the start, moving north toward Bordeaux, until the latter received a message from Talbot offering battle. Being close enough to help, Foix reinforced his comrade to face the challenge together, but this made the English commander withdraw to Bordeaux. The 2 forces subsequently split up and remained near the city in order to deal with any English sally. The Northern Army, meanwhile, began a methodical thrust through the Dordogne Valley, approaching the city of Castillon from the east in mid-July 1453. When Charles heard of the army's progress at his base at Saint-Jean-d'Angely, the king ordered it to besiege the city, which was at the time held by about 50 men-at-arms and 350 archers. In contrast, the assaulting army was a relatively standard one, about 8,000 men strong, but with an especially formidable siege train. Castillon itself was a strongly fortified town with the fast-flowing Dordogne River in the south, running east to west, and extensive forests to the north. In a clearing on the edge of this woodland, surrounded on three sides by trees, was the Priory of St. Florent, located on elevated ground rather than encircling and cutting off Castillon with fortifications, as in a traditionally conducted siege. Jean Bureau, who was put in overall command of conducting the operation, didn't want to be trapped in a pincer between Talbot and the garrison if English forces moved to relieve the city. Instead, he sent 1,000 crossbowmen to hold the priory, while he supervised the army's 700 engineers in constructing a fortified artillery park on the plain of Calais, made up of 300 guns, both heavy and light, operated by 700 gunners to protect the weapons. Defensive ditches were dug on three sides, backed by raised earthen ramparts, topped with formidable timber defenses. To screen the open northern flank of his enclosure, Bureau sent 1,000 Bretons to hold the village of Capito Yoral and Dot in Bordeaux. Talbot received an urgent letter from the English garrison in Castillon, which led to immense pressure from the Gascon city leaders to go out and relieve it. Possibly before he was ready, Talbot marched out with 6,000 English infantry, 2,000 Gascons, and 1,000 mounted archers and men-at-arms to do just that. After bypassing a few of their own towns and marching through quiet forested paths in the hills of Horrible to maintain surprise, the aging Talbot's Anglo-Gascon vanguard of 1,300 mounted troops assembled near the priory at dawn on July 17, 1453. When formed up, they burst out from the forest and attacked the priory from an unexpected direction, killing 120 of the French missile troops and capturing it after a brief but fierce fight. The remainder were harried in their retreat by the English cavalry until some of their own horse came in support. With that, Talbot's forces were pushed back, but managed to get valuable information about Bureau's artillery enclosure, which was reported to the commander, whose main force had just reached the priory. Its morale high from the vanguard's initial easy victory. Talbot initially decided not to follow up his attack immediately, believing that his troops needed to rest after the long march and initial skirmish. However, at the artillery park, Bureau was preparing for a fight by dismounting all of his horsemen and sending the horses away with their grooms. The movement of such a vast amount of horses kicked up a cloud of dust, which was spotted by English scouts and misinterpreted as a French retreat. When they reported back to Talbot that the enemy army was getting away, the commander reversed his judgment and decided to resume the assault, against the advice of a capable subordinate, Sir Thomas Everingham. It is said that the Earl swore to his personal chaplain that he could not hear Christian Mass until he had defeated the French army. With promises of loot at the enemy camp given, Talbot led his arrayed army along the northern bank of the Dordogne toward Bureau's fortification, speeding ahead with his mounted advance units, while the main body of infantry followed up in the rear. Their approach was spotted by French outriders who reported the incoming force to Bureau, while they were also followed by some supply ships in the river. As the English vanguard turned 90 degrees left to face the artillery park, Bureau was in the process of concentrating his 300 small cannons, mainly culverins and ribaldequins, on the southern rampart, facing Talbot's vanguard. The latter ordered his troops to dismount and fight on foot, but the completely unarmored English commander, who was so unprotected because of his oath to never bear arms against Charles VII ever again, remained in The saddle dot once again. Everingham advised caution against attacking such a well-prepared position, instead suggesting that it be starved out. Talbot refused and overruled him, fearing that any hesitation might harm his reputation. Seeing that Bureau hadn't yet finished moving all the cannons, Talbot ordered Everingham to lead the first charge. With a cry of St. George, he led the first attack, advancing across the field and assaulting the ramparts dot at such close range. The French light artillery inflicted heavy casualties on Everingham's men, supposedly killing 6 men with a single shot. The leader himself managed to get to the top of the wall, but was shot and killed by one of the French culverins. Despite the losses, fighting on the artillery park's southern edge went on. The main body of several thousand Anglo-Gascon infantry was now coming up, whose commander, Lord Kendall, was ordered against the enclosure's right flank. Because the troops were coming in unit by unit, the attack commenced piecemeal, with contingents being fed into the fight as they arrived, now reinforced by the infantry. Talbot's vanguard troops received a morale boost and attacked with renewed ferocity, inflicting casualties of their own, but suffering badly from the French culverin fire. Though Talbot's numbers were larger than Bureau's, the latter's strong fortification stalled the English attacks. After an hour of grinding and inconclusive combat on the ramparts, however, French forces were thinning, and those who remained were tiring. But at that moment, the 1,000 Bretons marched onto the battlefield from the northern hills, having received a message from Bureau earlier in the day. Other footmen streamed into the fortified artillery park and reinforced the beleaguered defenders. The Breton cavalry swept around the eastern trenches and crashed into Talbot's exposed right wing, wreathed in smoke and noise given off by the French gunpowder weapons. The English were taken totally by surprise. The aged Earl turned to meet the assault, but was wounded in the arm by a projectile. That wasn't the end of it. Seeing the English struck in the flank, French forces inside the fortification launched a counterattack from the front, some of them even remounting to do so. What happened next is unclear and varies in the sources, but it seems like Talbot's lines began to break, rooting toward the Dordogne. While this happened, the commander himself rallied a small contingent alongside his son and acted as a rearguard so his army could get away. However, a cannon shot the Earl's horse out from under him and trapped its rider under it. A family legend claims that while trapped, Talbot urged his son to flee, stating, "Leave me. The day belongs to the enemy. There is no disgrace in flight. This is your first battle." In what was perhaps the last gasp of chivalry the medieval age had to offer, the son refused and was killed alongside his father, who died from an axe to the skull. When the English commander's banner fell, the army lost heart and totally collapsed. Some soldiers drowned attempting to cross the Dordogne at Rouzen Ford. Others were run down by the victorious Breton horsemen, while about 1,000 found refuge. In Castillon itself, the Anglo-Gascon casualties are uncertain, ranging from a low of 500 to a high of 4,000, while French losses were quite light in comparison. When Jean Bureau found Talbot's corpse on the field, he had the old soldier given a burial with full honors. Similarly, when his banner and collar of office were given to Charles VII, the king remarked, "God have mercy on a good knight." Talbot had never broken his oath. Castillon was taken on July 20th, and the French king even rode with his army to quell a small internal squabble. That strife was nothing compared to Gascony, which, despite stubborn resistance, was falling one castle at a time. Bordeaux was put under siege, and 10 weeks later, after being strangled and battered from both land and sea, finally fell to Charles. On October 19, 1453, French banners were raised above the city, and the English in Gascony were forced to leave. With the second capitulation of Bordeaux, the 100 Years' War came to an effective end, although contemporaries were unaware of this. Of the great Angevin Empire that had spanned from the English Channel to the Pyrenees, Only Calais and a few satellite forts remained in Plantagenet hands. England went from a state with a continental element to a purely insular one. No treaty was signed in 1453, and the two kingdoms remained in a state of war, as French privateers would continue to raid the English coast for prisoners to ransom, and sizable garrisons were kept in Normandy and Gascony to prevent further English expeditions and to quell dissent in the newly integrated provinces. Only in 1475 did this state of war actually conclude. In that year, the first English army to invade France since Talbot's touched Calais, with the stated goal to divide up the French realm with the Burgundians and Bretons. But as the French and English army faced off, the Treaty of Picquigny between Edward IV of England and Louis XI of France was signed. This was officially a 7-year truce, but became the de facto peace treaty that ended the war. In exchange for a sizable yearly stipend and an upfront payment, the English would leave France, and both sides would not support the other's internal rebels. The peace would be remarkably durable and last until 1492, and no English king would seriously attempt to reclaim the French throne, although they would still style themselves Rex Franziae until the Napoleonic era. The Pale of Calais would instead be lost in the closing years of the Italian Wars, when in 1558, a lightning attack by the French took most of the ring of fortresses around Calais and forced the city to surrender in a week, kicking the English out from the continent for good. The immediate political effects were acutely felt in England. The Lancastrian throne had always been weak after the death of Henry V, as the late king was the son of a usurper and left his infant son, Henry VI, as the sole male heir. It was thanks to the regency of the Duke of Bedford and his connections with the House of Burgundy that the English had managed to keep a hold over northern France. When the king, a shy and weak personality, came of age, he did not give any leadership to the country, and his rule was overshadowed by court factionalism between different family members and his wife, Margaret of Anjou. In late 1453, Henry VI fell into a catatonic state, completely unable to rule. This exacerbated a political struggle between Richard of York and Edmund of Somerset, who was temporarily detained. The struggle culminated in 1455, when it degenerated into civil war at the Battle of St. Albans, marking the beginning of the War of the Roses. Many of the grievances that were the causes of the Civil War can be traced back to the conduct of the 100 Years' War and the financial and territorial losses. Also, Edward III had created duchies for his sons during his reign, which had given royal princes enormous wealth and following that could threaten the position of the king. As the subsequent civil war would show, King Charles VII of France had mostly pushed the English out of the continent, but he did not feel secure. Local supporters had supported every English invasion, whether from Flanders, Normandy, or Brittany, or during periods of internal conflict, such as the Civil War between the Armagnacs and Burgundians got the different provinces that composed the kingdom, and their rulers looked much more at their own interests than those of the kingdom as a whole, and they had the threat of opening up to an English invasion to pursue these goals. The king was acutely aware of this. A Gascon noble was executed in 1454 after plotting to capture Bayonne in the name of the English, while the lands of the Dukes of Alencon and Armagnac were confiscated in the following years as they were conspiring with the English, or were likely to do so. The successor of Charles VII, Louis XI, embarked on a centralization effort to further curtail the autonomy of the Appanage nobles and intended to absorb his main rivals, the duchies of Brittany and Burgundy. The Burgundian house died out in 1477, allowing the crown to absorb much of their French holdings, and would lead to a century-long conflict with the Habsburg family, while Brittany would be integrated during the subsequent generation. The 100 Years' War left a stronger national identity in both countries, fostered by mutual antagonism. The war brought the state closer to the population with the high taxation and broad recruitment of archers, so the population was more invested as a whole in the war than what a Burgundian might have been. Within a generation, the English nobility dropped the use of French, which had been their mother tongue, in favor of English. France had a long history of regional identities that frustrated the ability of the French king, but a century of war and crisis weakened these borders, allowing for more power of the central state to spread to the peripheries. The French identity was reinforced in decades of war, plundering, and occupation of garrisons. While in the first half of the war, the population's hatred was generally against soldiers. Following the Battle of Agincourt, this hatred was directed against the English enemy. The scars of the war would endure on the population of France. First, as with most of Europe, the Black Death devastated both countries. Then, after a relatively long truce following the Carolingian period, the war sparked up again with the Lancastrian period. The regions that became the battlefield, particularly in northern France, felt the effect for a century and would spend decades to recover as villages were left depopulated and fields were reclaimed by forest. The regions that recovered the fastest were those around Paris, where large churches and monastic orders had enough capital to invest in rebuilding villages and cutting wood. England was not ravaged nearly as much as France, although many coastal raids remained in the common consciousness and the threat of Scottish attacks was ever present. What changed most for the country was their cutoff from their biggest export market. Wool. The wool trade had been nationalized during the reign of Edward III, and the monarchy was able to control its export in Calais, as it was the only source of high-quality wool in northern Europe. The loss of Gascony, which for centuries had been part of the English crown, had been damaging in particular for individuals who had invested in land or had been assigned titles, and the trade of Gascon wine halted following 1453, but it would resume a few decades later. The 100 Years' War was the longest series of medieval conflicts and probably the period's most famous war, with surprising reversals, fascinating figures, grandiose battles, and effects that were felt in all of Western Europe. It shaped the trajectory that both France and England would take. France came out stronger, with a more centralized state, and would be one of the most important actors in European politics in the following centuries, while England was relegated to its island and weakened its connection to the continent. The transition from a feudal system to a more centralized one can be observed particularly in taxation and army recruitment. These developments took place in different capacities in most of Western Europe, but the war characterized the paths of England and France. During the 1430s, Charles VII managed to greatly increase taxation by annually summoning the General Estates to demand taxes. In 1439, he issued an ordinance proclaiming that only the king was entitled to raise troops and taxes, threatening the autonomy of the princes. Crucially, Charles managed to impose the principle of permanent taxation during his reign without the need to have it accepted by the estates, leveraging the aids and tails after the war's end. Although regional differences in privileges made taxation heterogeneous. Also, during the truce in the 1440s, he created the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, professional permanent armies, fully funded by the king's tax revenue, which would become the backbone of the army that fought against the nobles in the 1460s and 1480s and invaded Italy in 1494. England had already been quite centralized for its time before and during the war, although the power of the parliament increased as the kings became more desperate for taxes, and it would maintain a constraint on the monarchies in the following centuries. Another critical development in warfare was the introduction of gunpowder, with cannons becoming an ever more important element in sieges as the war progressed. Ends our gentle journey through one of history's most transformative conflicts, dear listener. As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the echoes of this great medieval drama, from Edward III's bold claims to Joan of Arc's miraculous intervention. from the thunder of Agincourt to the quiet dignity of Talbot's final stand. The 100 Years' War teaches us that even the mightiest empires must eventually yield to change, that courage can emerge from the most unlikely places, and that the course of history often turns on moments of individual choice and national determination. May these tales of medieval valor and wisdom carry you gently into dreams of castle towers bathed in moonlight, of quiet monastery gardens where monks copied illuminated manuscripts, and of the soft sound of wind through ancient battlefields. Now return to peaceful meadows. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and thank you for joining us on this complete journey through one of history's most epic chapters. Until we meet again in another tale from the past, may your rest be as peaceful as a summer evening in a medieval garden, filled with the gentle scent of herbs and the distant sound of chapel bells.